The Buttonwoods Museum would like to thank everybody for coming tonight. We'll get your chairs in 1 minute if there's not enough. Give me 1 minute, we'll get you some chairs. So we'd like to thank you all for coming out on this nice, warm New England night. There's plenty of coffee and hot chocolate down there. We're located on the traditional lands and the waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. So that's our land talk. So without further ado, though, let's welcome Jill with a big hand. All right.
Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, we got a diverse group of people here, and everybody has a little bit of a different background. So there's going to be parts of the talk you might be familiar with and parts not so much. This is a picture of Haverhill in 1871. Yeah, and obviously Mount Washington would be like up here, right? And in 1871, you can see Upper Washington is still a dirt road. You can see the railroad bridge, and this is the railroad bridge, excuse me. Railroad bridge here, this is the Basileer or the 125 here. But in between, you can already see all the factories, all the shoe factories. All right, 1871. Just keep that in mind, this image of 1871, that Upper Washington was a dirt road. Okay, so next we got two different stories converging. We have the history of the shoe industry in Haverhill, and that's converging with the immigration of the Jews into Haverhill, along with so many other groups that immigrated into Haverhill to work in the shoe industry. And the stories are very similar in many ways. People came for work. Their children were better educated than they were, so they wouldn't have to work in the factories, and sort of blend in and everybody becomes an American. So in many ways, the story's the same. Now, let's go back and figure out, how did the shoe industry develop in Haverhill? Well, in 1790, according to the census, the population of Haverhill was only 2,400 souls. Right? 2,400 people. Most worked on the farms, and you had a shipbuilding industry and some merchants. Right? So they'd transfer the goods to smaller boats, bring them upriver, and sell them inland to the farmers further up the Merrimack. And in 1794, there were 2 cordwainers in all of Haverhill. Cordwainer makes a shoe from start to finish. That's the official name. If you're a shoemaker, has come to mean almost what a cobbler. So, and then 1795, Moses Gale takes out an ad offering hides on credit. And you can return him your finished shoes and get a little change back. Think about that. Because it shifts everything. By 1817, we have 200 cordwainers in town. And again, the boundaries of Haverhill have changed, so we all know that. And that's the era of the shoe shops. And we have a shoe shop on the property. Again, another landmark, 1839. The railroad comes to Haverhill. It came to Bradford in 1837, but Haverhill in 1839. And they were still separate towns then. 1845, the sewing machine is invented. Once the sewing machine is adapted for making shoes, and along with the addition of machines to pound the leather soft enough to be pliable to make the shoes, again, by 1880, the population is 18,472 people. That's quite an increase in a short amount of time. Then the next big event is 1882, the big fire. We all know about the fire. Is there anybody who doesn't know about the fire?
No.
Really? One person doesn't know about the fire. Oh, no. Okay, quite a few people. All right. February of 1882, there was a huge fire downtown, crisped everything from Wingate Street, the south side of Wingate Street to the river. And that's where all these shoe factories were. So as the shoe shops realized, well, maybe somebody is a little better at making the finished tops of the shoes, and somebody else is better at making the soles of the shoes or whatever, it blossomed and it became more of a factory system. So that's sort of after the fire in 1882, when everything started getting rebuilt, they built back bigger and better. And the factories extended out onto River Street. The last shoe factory to close in Haverhill was Allen Shoes. That closed in the early 90s. And if you know where Paul Martin Antiques are, same building. All right. So that gets us to how we got to the shoes. Next slide, please. And this is interesting to me, because this is 1910, and the population is 45,000. Think about that. How much of a jump in the population in such a short time. And it wasn't just the Jews that had immigrated, it was the Italians, it was the Armenians, on and on and on. The Greeks. So, what was the attraction? Low rates, electric light and power. This is an advertisement for coming to start your business in Haverhill. Yeah, and it was still the city-owned power company. Well, the current wave of immigrants are the Dominican people, right? Dominicans. They're the ones living on Mount Washington now. And what does Haverhill still have that's relatively inexpensive to the surrounding communities? Water. Because we have municipal water. And that's why there's so many food processing plants in Haverhill. And again, it's a draw for the first immigrants coming. And again, if you go up to Mount Washington, you'll see a lot of storefronts with Spanish on it and so forth. Because when you're a new immigrant coming, you want to feel the transition is so harsh that if you can eat the food you ate back home, if you can worship the way you worshiped back home, it helps with the transition. And so that's why we're having this conversation about Jewish Haverhill. And before we go any further, I just want to, before I forget, there's a lot of people to thank for making this talk possible. There's, Tom, Emily, and Carol from the museum. There's a special collections people at the library, Bev and Liz. Paula, Temple Emmanuel here in Haverhill's librarian. And earlier, there were some late 1970s, some of the women from Temple Emmanuel whose parents grew up here in Haverhill, started an oral history project. And some of the information here comes from that. And that was May Ispovich, Charlotte Goltz, Dorothy Tide, and most importantly, I owe a big debt here to Bertha Woodman, and she wrote a book. This is my copy. There's a copy that belongs to the museum on the back, From the Hill to Main Street. And it is more information than we could possibly cover tonight. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So this is interesting to me because there's no record of any Jews living in Haverhill until 1878, okay, that stayed. Yeah, here's Jew Street on an 1850 map of Haverhill. It's currently called Hilldale Avenue. Okay? Yeah, right. You can see it. Yeah, right? So here we go. Now, was it called Jew Street? Kind of lost in the fog of history. According to Bertha, because I feel like I know her well enough to call her by her first name, she had spoken to somebody who worked at Buttonwoods back then who said they vaguely remember their grandparents saying at some point a Jewish family lived on the street, but they didn't last, and they picked up and left. But don't really know, but it's curious. Just a little.
Do you know when the street name changed?
I'm sorry?
Do you know when the street name changed?
When it changed.
Somewhere between 1850 and 1860. Don't really know exactly, because you can just go by the maps. Where did most of the Jews come from that came to Haverhill, right? And why? So this comes from the Jewish Virtual Library, and it's a map of the Pale. And some of you, like me, had grandparents who came from the Pale, and know all about it, and some not so much.
What is the Pale?
Well, this is, you see Germany, Baltic Sea, this would be like Lithuania, down to the Black Sea. And at that time period, it was all owned by Russia. So it's Ukraine, all the way on up. And it was this map is the Pale 1835 to 1917. And this is where Russia corralled the Jewish population. A pale is a spike, as you would put a spike in the fence. And that's where the expression beyond the pale comes from. And this is interesting because it's saying in 1891, for example, 20,000 Jews were expelled from Moscow. Again, telling you all the horrible events and why things became worse and worse. But life in the Pale was not good. It was not, it became more restrictive and more restrictive. No, you can't own land. No, you can't work in this occupation. No, you can't work in that occupation. But the worst one was the men being impressed into the Tsar's army to be used as cannon fodder. So, what are you going to do? You're going to leave. And this is an interesting one. Principal town from which, the Exodus began, and over 2 million Jews from the Pale migrated to the United States, Britain, Europe, South America, Palestine. They left Canada off the list. So this is where probably 98% of the Jews that landed in Haverhill came from. Now, how do you get from here, when you don't have a lot of money, to Haverhill, right? Well, some of the factory owners hired agents to recruit workers. And so let's say you walked your way to, where is it? Well, here's Warsaw, but Vilna was popular. The coast, and it doesn't show Riga. I'm not pronouncing it right. R-I-G-A. That was a popular place for the agents. And they would you would just sign a contract saying you'd pay the money back when you got a job in America. Sound familiar? And then there's the people who maybe had enough money for the boat ride, and they arrive in New York, and they're like, huh? Well, there were agencies like the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, which still exists, to help you along. And Bertha, in her book, has an exchange of letters from the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society to one of the rabbis that was in Haverhill then, asking if indeed this person had a job waiting for them and could pay back the train fare. So that's where the people came from. This is a picture from the inside of the Chick Shoe Factory in the, probably about 1890, I'm guessing. I don't know the exact date. And we've all seen this photo if we've spent any time on Haverhill history, because there weren't a lot of photos from inside the factories. So we're going to take a moment here and talk about and leave that photo up, just so you understand how harsh the conditions were working in the factories. So in 1878, Moses Morris arrives in Haverhill, and he is the first Jew that comes here and stays. And he was a grocery peddler in Boston, and he heard he could earn more money working in a shoe factory in Haverhill. So he came up here. And his first job was as a laster in the Gupter Shoe Factory. He and Mary had 9 children. Needless to say, the family had a lot of firsts. Jacob was, their son Jacob was the first Jew to graduate from Haverhill High School and later from Boston University in 1904. Isidore became a dentist and Abraham a doctor. Pretty big jump from there to being a doctor and a dentist. Let's see. And as more Jews arrived, so did services to the community, because there were some Jews who were not going to desecrate the Sabbath and work on Saturday. And you work 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. That was the work week then. And so some became peddlers because you didn't have refrigerators, so you had to get your groceries daily. And others, an example of a successful peddler would be the Rosengard brothers, and I'm sure the Rosengard name still rings a chime. Eli and Lewis, who owned a store at 3436 Winter Street, which is interesting because we think everybody ended up on the hill, but they didn't all end up on the hill. But Eli and Ann Rosengard were the first couple to be married, Jewish couple to be married in Haverhill. The Espovich family arrived and bought a farm on the upper end of Washington Street and ran a dairy. I mean, it was Tevye the milkman all over again. And when he arrived, he and his oldest son came, and when he had earned enough money, he sent for the rest of the family. And as time went on, there was a kosher, people originally lived on River Street, then they moved up to what we call Mount Washington. And most of the stores are gone because as Fantini's Bakery expanded, their parking lot needed to get bigger, their loading dock needed to get bigger, and so it was paved over. So, let's see. Then I want to just talk about significant moments as we go on. So there was a big fire in 1882, and that was in February. By March, they're laying the bricks, they're building the buildings back. And, you know, the first block on Washington Street where the restaurants are, that was all built March 1882. The first congregation was Beth Jacob. And that was on River Street, and that was the synagogue on the flyer. And we'll get through the history of the synagogues later. But they met in rented space and also started the Hebrew Progressive Association, which was English as a second language, what you needed to know to get by in the United States. 1893, the Children of Israel Cemetery Association is founded, and 12 acres of land is purchased on Middle Road. Cemetery is still there. You can still buy a plot. The Haverhill Kadisha, the burial society, was a mitzvah. It was a good deed. So while nobody made money burying the dead, people generally donated money to the Haverhill afterwards, and that was redistributed for the needy. So if your bill got, you know, you couldn't pay the grocer, you couldn't pay your rent, you know. And what is amazing about the detail in Bertha's book is how many different associations were founded, like from the like educating the kids for their Hebrew lessons to the outing for green space for a picnic on a Sunday afternoon. I mean, it was just amazing what a tight-knit community grew up. 1893, it's a big year in the history of the United States and the history of the shoe industry in general. The panic of 1893, we probably call it a really bad recession or a minor depression, but 1893 was not a good year. And the owners decided, well, we'll just cut our workers' wages by a third. Now these people, there was a slight ding on a shoe and it was like a little less than perfect, it was deducted from your pay. There was a minimum amount of shoes you had to produce. Nobody was making a lot of money working in the shoe factories. So cutting the wages by a third just was not a good idea. So there was the strike in 1895. And the owners at first sent down to New York and said, send us some more men who just came off the boat. We need more workers. These people didn't speak English. They didn't know there was a strike going on. They didn't know they were scabs. And an example that Bertha gives was a gentleman named Jacob Blaustein, who just got off the boat, didn't know anything, and he was locked in the factory until they got, and along with a few other people, got enough shoes produced to, you know. And when he finally got out and people explained to him what was going on, he'd go back to work. Well, how did this strike end? Well, the strikers lost the battle, but they won the war, is basically the way you could put it. They ended up going back to work because people got hungry. But the Yankee owners, and one of the oral histories, Rabbi Jacobson describes it beautifully on what happened. And he said, and this is a direct quote, "The Yankees started giving up the shoe factories. The Jewish people then took the factories that the Yankees were giving up, and all they had to do was cover overhead. And when covering overhead, they found that they didn't have to make $1.50 on a pair of shoes, and they dealt with the unions. In fact, factories that didn't deal with the unions found themselves out of business. So they dealt with the unions. They took their share of income, and that way more and more Jews stepped in where the Yankees stepped out." So again, the Yankee owners thought they could just move the shoes business, up further north where there were no unions. you could lease equipment at that time period. You didn't have to buy the equipment outright, you could lease it. So even if the prior factory owner took the machinery out, you could lease it. Lots of different options. So that was the 1895 strike. And post-strike, the Jewish business folks really started figuring out different angles on how to expand the shoe business. So Max Mostrovsky bought damaged shoes at the weekly auction and began selling them. Seconds, we call them today. Scraps of leather could be turned into baby shoes. And how many remember Snyder leather? Right? Yeah. And they sold belts, bags, wallets. Again, the leather that was left over after the shoes were cut. So, and there were, among the names, and I'm sure those of you who have lived in Haverhill much longer than I, there was, Sam Shapiro was S&S Shoes. And he started with family as workers, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Meyer Ornstein. And while his building just got knocked down for the new apartments by the Bradford Railroad Station, the original building he was in is where the Phoenix Row apartments are today. So, again, the buildings, some of the buildings are still there. So, let's see, what's our, so we want to go next one. Okay, we're going to go for a little bit about the history of the synagogues. This is when Beth Jacob was finally able to afford a building of its own. This was on River Street. Oh, I guess we got the exact address sliced off a little bit. I think it was 121, I'm not positive. It's been knocked down. And it amazes me how quickly they were able to build it to be a synagogue. It wasn't a repurposed church. It cost $25,000 and it opened in 1899. So in 1898, they had hired the architect, raised enough money, they could do it. Think about that. 3 years after the strike, they were able to get enough money together to do this. I'm impressed by that one. And this was generally referred to, Beth Jacob was generally referred to as the Litvak, or the Lithuanian synagogue. And we'll get, next slide, please. And that last picture was taken in 1916. And this picture was also taken in 1916. And this is of the Avos Achim on Shepherd Street. They were more than willing to repurpose a church. And when they outgrew this space, this turned into the home of the Jewish Progressive Association.
Where is Shepherd Street?
Mount Washington.
Oh, okay.
Mount Washington.
Jill, do you want us to hold questions?
All right, it doesn't matter. It's fine.
So, no, I was gonna ask you a question.
Sure.
Were all these synagogues Orthodox?
Yes.
There were
Yeah.
no Reform temples?
Not yet. We're early here. This is 1916.
Well, I know, but the Reform came to this country in the 1860s.
Not here.
They came up-
Not here, because this is still the first generation. They want to worship the way they worship back home. This is where they need some familiarity in customs.
It's where they came from, that's the point.
You're right, and this is Russian. This was referred to as the Russian synagogue.
I just have a question about Jew Street again. Is it like a street name that you find in other towns, but it's only in Haverhill? I've never seen that anywhere else.
I'm sure it was somewhere else, but I was surprised when I saw it.
Seems kind of offensive.
Yeah, it's odd.
Yeah.
Going way back to earlier in your talk, the Jews that came over maybe by
almost like indentured relationship to pay off their
Debt
patent.
contracts.
Did they, first land in, New York and Boston, and then they took buses up here?
Or trains.
Or trains, yeah.
Yeah, the train. Yes, that's basically, you came through, people came through, Boston, but most people came through New York. It was just higher volume in New York. But yes, people did land in Boston also.
And as far as you know, it was mainly from Lithuania and Russia?
Yeah, it's mostly people from the Pale. Bertha mentions that there were some Sephardic, and she used the example of sometimes people ran out of money when they hit England, and they would work for a couple years in England. So one gentleman married a woman in London. That community was Sephardic. So, you know, she didn't speak Yiddish, so she didn't speak English. She landed here. She was like, who's going to talk to me except for she spoke English? So she was good. But, yeah, the vast majority of people here were Ashkenazi Jews from the Pale.
So that's not Poland?
It wasn't Poland then.
Yeah.
The borders are malleable. So if you think of it, it would be Eastern Poland today. There's a lot of articles about the Pale. If you just Google it, the Jewish Virtual Library one I liked best, but there's a lot out there. Good. This is when Beth Jacob in 1923 moved up to the hill, to Mount Washington, because as people did better, the housing was a little better on Mount Washington. And while you think it was a combination of Jewish and Italian, lived on Mount Washington, or Courier Square, if you want to call it Courier Square. So again, these folks wanted a building that looked like a synagogue, that was built to be a synagogue. So they built this. Unfortunately, in the 50s, it crisped. It was destroyed in a fire, but so it was quite the beautiful building. And again, it's still Orthodox. This is the final building of Vasa he was in, and this building still stands. And I'm not really sure what it's being used for right now, whether it's some kind of transitional housing or something, but it still stands. You know, what's interesting is this is where Fantini Bakery is. This is the parking lot over here. You see P, which is a pharmacy, and Mr. Cowan was the first Jewish pharmacist in Haverhill, and that's where he was. So again, we know there's still stores across the street like Benedetti's, you know, home of the rocket if you want your submarine salad. But all the stores that were across the street, Fantini kept expanding. So that's basically the loading dock and parking lot of Fantini's. This is, it used to be the Union Congregationalist Church. This is the Temple Emmanuel today, all right? And this is where the sanctuary is. Because in the olden days, the synagogue was just for praying. The Hebrew school was separate, the community activities were separate. But this is the original building. And what's interesting is it opened, the late 1930s. And Rabbi Jacobson was hired to work there. And he wanted to modernize a little bit. So it opened as a conservative synagogue originally because you don't want too much change. A little change. The men and women can now sit together. I mean, just a little bit of change. So, and I'm sure there's people here who remember Rabbi Jacobson, and I see a smile. And reading his oral history, I can understand why. I mean, the charisma just jumped off the page. So Temple Emmanuel opened in 1937 on Main Street, and partly because everybody walked to services. And by 1937, the Jews didn't all live on the hill. So it was a hike. You lived over off of Mill Street? Yeah, that's you lived over in Bradford? So, it was, a lot of the shoe moguls actually ended up on, Columbia Park. So now I'm gonna digress a little bit because I feel like it. In 1905, backing up in time, there were a group of men who liked to play poker once a week. After all, no TV. And so on the oral history for Isidore and Lillian Morris, and Isidore was the son of the original 1878 settler, so he remembers. So the question, did you know Louis B. Mayer? Yes, I did. He used to play poker in the same crowd as my father did. Mr. Ornstein, Mr. Jonas, shoe manufacturers. One night he said, if I had $300, I could buy the Gem Theater, which was in Lafayette Square. And that was, and so those poker friends of his got $300 together for him, and he bought the Gem Theater. Changed the name to Lafayette Theater. And one of the things that amazed me was the creativity of all these first generation people. Now, Louis B. Mayer's, originally his last name was spelled M-E-I-R, not M-A-Y-E-R. But changing your name was, if it made life easier, you changed your name. And he had the foresight that cinema was going to be the next big thing. The Gem Theater was vaudeville. Passé. Vaudeville's going to be passé. So it turned it into a cinema. And that, as they say, the rest is history. So every time you see that MGM logo on a movie, on a building or whatever, Metro Goldwyn Mayer. Remember, Leo got his start in Haverhill. So that's my little digression story.
Can you tell me the name of the theater? How do you spell that?
Gem, G-E-M. There, and part of the reason for telling that story is to understand what a bustling community Haverhill had become. There were hotels, there were live entertainment, obviously, because, yeah, and it just is something that, as the rate of change becomes more and more rapid, we forget that, I always think my grandfather was so good about change. As soon as the Model Ts came out, he had to have a Model T. But when it came to the man landing on the moon, that was a little bit too far for him. He couldn't, he was born in the shuttle in the pail, and man landed on the moon, no. So anyway, I got to speed up here because we're running out of time, huh? All right. We're going to talk about, as Rabbi Jacobson talked about, anti-Semitism in Haverhill. Of course there was. There always has been anti-Semitism, and we'd like to think it will go away someday. But in the 1920s and 30s, even the Ku Klux Klan was even active in Massachusetts. So, and as Rabbi Jacobson, to quote him, said, and being the boss owner of the factories didn't help. But this is an interesting little backstory. It says, New Deal to buy the Island Golf Club. And what happened was, we're doing better. We want to play golf. Haverhill Country Club would open. Well, the Haverhill Country Club wasn't going to have Jews in their membership. So they said, we'll just go buy the Island Golf Course. So it's an island in the Merrimack. There's a golf course on it. There's a little tiny house there, but it was just basically where you could put your golf shoes on. It wasn't real fancy. In the beginning, you had to row your boat over, and then they built a little bridge to make it a little easier.
Whereabouts is that?
Probably about where across from like where Chris's farm is now, like down there.
What is?
You know where Chris's farm stand is on Salem Street?
Okay.
Yeah, it's past the Crescent Yacht Club. Downstream from that. So life was good. You could go play golf. Then the flood of 1936 happened. Goodbye golf course.
Is that island still there?
Yeah, the island's still there, but the golf course is long since gone. And actually, I don't know that there's anything on the island anymore. Next one. Oh, and the ironic thing about that story is that around the late 30s, the Depression was on. The Haverhill Country Club was in financial difficulty. We were about to file for bankruptcy. Guess who bought them? And the Haverhill Country Club was open to anybody who could afford the entrance fee. So we're going a little forward in time here because we're running out. Western Electric comes to Haverhill in 1942, middle of World War II. And that was a real game changer because Western Electric hired not only blue-collar workers, they hired white-collar workers, needed engineers, people to work in the labs, accountants, lawyers. So, yeah, they ended up building the big place on 125 just over in North Andover. But this is Locust Street, original building that they inhabited. And again,
Is it still there?
yeah, this isn't there, but yeah, this is there. I believe it's one of the loft apartments now. Is it Cordova? I forget. Cordova? No, it's not.
The
The
Cordova
building
was
is
the
just
Goldberg
before.
family.
So the smaller buildings, that's the city parking lot across from Maria's restaurant.
Okay, all right, I'm with you.
So the tall part of the building, that still remains.
Right. And what amazes me is like how many huge, like on Essex Street, those buildings all built around, I would say, the turn of the century, but we're gotta say around around 1900 to 1910. But by World War I, 10% of the shoes manufactured in the United States were made in Haverhill. So this kind of changed a little bit the whole thing. But again, the amount of shoes that were produced here and the wealth that it brought to the town, Haverhill was the bustling center for all the towns around. You did your retail shopping here, so forth and so on. So this is just, and I picked Corellis Jewelers for a reason. You'll see, understand later on. But there were also a lot of Jewish merchants, and I remember Gershon Furniture, which was knocked down, is now VA housing. But again, if you weren't here then, you don't really, the amount of change that came, and obviously urban renewal was a disaster, but what are you gonna do? At least they stopped before it got worse, realized the mistakes. We better keep moving. So I wanted to get a feel for what life might have been like here for the 50s. And so I just took a couple samples so this is Lewis Hartman's obituary, July 10th, 1957. Lewis Hartman was a big shoe manufacturer. So he was the building was on Duncan Street. I don't know if Falcone pianos are still being made there. But look at all he did. This was in the Globe. So, died, active in shoe industry and Jewish affairs, died at Hale Hospital. And he came here 50 years ago, and blah, blah, blah. But all the thing. founder of Temple Emmanuel, treasurer of Beth Jacob, and maintained a membership in a synagogue in New York. He was also a member of the Greater Haverhill Chamber of Commerce, blah, blah, blah. Now you gotta go on and on and on and on and on. How do you do all of that? Do you ever sleep? I mean, but again, it was the normal. I did well. I want to give back. So, and again, you know, they have a lot. It's just amazing to me how many different organizations Mr. Hartman belonged to. And again, flows outward. Next. And this was a picture I originally took because a friend of mine's mother was in it. But it shows how life had changed for Jewish women. So the first generation, they could get a job in a shoe factory, they were gonna work in the shoe factory. And some packed, the women tended to put the shoes in the boxes, maybe do the finished sewing, attach the bows, that kind of stuff. But they could still work in the factory. The next ones, when they got a little education, they're the bookkeepers. They're running the office. But by the 1950s, for a man, the badge of honor was that their wife did not have to work. And they could spend their time raising money for good causes. So, again, how much life has shifted, and how, and that was, I thought, an interesting way to look at things. Because we're running out of time, we're going to keep moving. And I want to talk about the legacies. There's physical legacy, and then there's spiritual legacy. So I let's first talk about the spiritual legacy, and then we'll get to the physical. Spiritual legacy, going back to the anti-Semitism story, Rabbi Jacobson said, I got to do something about this. What can I do about it? So he reached out to the other members of the clergy in Haverhill, started the Haverhill Clergy Association, which still exists, to try and communicate that we have more in common than we are different. And if, again, I'm sure you have all heard the sad news about Temple Emmanuel, but a week from tomorrow night will be the annual Martin Luther King service. If you've never gone, it is quite an experience and quite, it's enjoyable and it's uplifting.
Free of charge.
And free. Just like tonight.
What's like the sad news about it?
Excuse me? It's the building's been sold.
Oh.
I do not know what the final outcome is going to be, whether they'll end up, because it's now reformed, going from conservative to reformed. I do not know if it will end up merging with the Reformed Synagogue in Andover, or, you know, there'll be a rental space, you know, for people to stay local. I do not know the answer to that.
But the event is still there?
Huh? It's still till June 30th. So the service a week from tomorrow night will be this location. This little building, what happened was to the synagogues in on top of Mount Washington, Beth Jacob and Avos Achim, is they merged in the mid-50s. Beth Jacob had burnt down, and the population that was willing to walk to services on Mount Washington diminished, so they merged. And then in the mid-1960s, they bought this church on Main Street. It's a few blocks more toward us, where we're sitting now, than the big temple. And the gentleman who took care of it for many years got too old, you know, I don't want to do this anymore. It's like, you know, we're getting a little old for this. So they worked out an arrangement to transfer the property to the Chabad of the Merrimack Valley. And unfortunately, Rabbi Bornstein had planned to attend tonight, but he has COVID. So, again, if you want to learn more about it, the website is jewishhaverhill.org. And the final slide is the physical presence. So this was underneath where it says Paul Martin Antiques is Allen's Shoe Company. And what happened was the original Corellis brothers, one of them died and ownership changed, and where is it? It was Sam Ty bought half of the business. His son's name was Allen, so they named it the Allen Shoe Company. And this was the last shoe factory to close in Haverhill. One more legacy item is, I don't know if any of you saw the Globe article a few weeks ago, there's a copy of it on the table in the back, that Stuart Weitzman, and Weitzman father had a shoe factory in Haverhill, is donating his shoe collection to Historic New England, and they are going to have a permanent display of it with a little history of the shoe industry. So when they open the new building that they got bought on Essex Street, that's going to be the first exhibit, according to the article. And it's interesting because Stuart Weitzman was born on Long Island. I mean, it's not like he lived here, but his father, Mr. Seymour Shoes. If anybody has Mr. Seymour shoes in a closet and they're in good condition, put them up on eBay. They're selling. No. So that's going to be another physical legacy of this story. Okay, now questions, Rabbi.
I was always told that the reason that the textile mills, the shoe factories all moved south was because of the unions, and they could build, because I lived down south, so they didn't have unions, you could build them much more inexpensively. But you're saying that they were all unionized, so what was the incentive to move to the south?
A lot of them, they didn't just move to the south, they moved to production overseas. And Weitzman is a prime example of that. In 1971, Seymour Weitzman sold the company to a Spanish company, and they produced the shoes in Spain. And again, I think some of it was the EPA. Tannery business is nasty. It's a big polluter. So I think there were a lot of factors besides the labor being cheaper. I mean, the Yankee owners moved the shoe it up to New Hampshire and Maine because they weren't unionized. And so it wasn't only that. I think part of it here was that you didn't want your children to work as hard as you worked. It was easier for them to be a doctor or a lawyer or to be an engineer and go work for somebody else. They didn't want their children. And I think it was Saul Corellis who said that in his oral history interview, and when asked, do you want your son in the business? And he's like, no. And again, a gentleman I talked to grew up in Haverhill and lived on the Mount. His father had an oil burner service. And he said he got out of college, and Dad said, well, are you going to come work in the business? And he's like, well, And then Western Electric opened it, and he was a CPA, so he got a job there. He said, I didn't want to, you don't want to get the phone ringing 2 o'clock in the morning, my furnace broke. So I think it was a combination of things. I don't think it was just one thing. In the back there.
Yeah, I wonder if you have any statistics on the size of the Jewish community over the years.
Well, to give you an idea, and again, because the census doesn't break down by religion, so accurate numbers not so much, but Temple Emmanuel, as late as like the 70s, had a membership, like 400 units, right? Think about that, 400 units, that's like at least 800 people. So again, I don't really have an answer for you. There's, and I'm sorry, but I don't have an answer for you. I know it was at least like 1,000 people at one point. I really don't know. And I apologize, but I don't.
So what's happening with the Jewish community in Haverhill now?
Well, that's a good question. Because what happened is, in the 90s and so forth, people like me, well, I moved here in '88, worked in the software industry. So you just moved here because you had a job nearby. And at that point, Temple Emmanuel was buzzing. I used to play volleyball there once a week when I first moved here, because it was a way to meet people. You know, again, I think it's a what's happened is what has happened to organized religion generally in this country, that less people are affiliating formally, so it becomes more of an informal situation. What's happening, we'll know 20 years from now what's happening. Because until it's happened, we don't really know. So I don't really have an answer for you. Again, the
Well,
Chabad.
in terms of how many like synagogues are left, or I heard something.
Well, there's Temple Emmanuel is still in business, and I do not know exactly how it's going to turn out. The Chabad is running Anshe Shalom, and I don't know if that's going to take off or if that will fold either. Also, I don't know.
Is running something, you said?
Anshe Shalom
That's the name of the.
synagogue.
Oh, okay.
The name of the synagogue is Anshe Shalom.
Okay.
So when the two Orthodox synagogues that were on Mount Washington merged, they renamed themselves Anshe Shalom, and they moved to an old church they bought on Main Street. And of course, in keeping with history, Temple Emmanuel has been sold to a church. So we'll go back to its original being. Yes?
Down on Route 110, down near where John Rennie Whittier's birthplace is,
Mhm.
there's Middle Road, if you turn off.
Yeah, there's the cemetery.
And that's a huge number
That's the
of
cemetery.
Jewish cemeteries, and they certainly predate the beginnings.
No, it's 1893.
One Jewish cemetery.
One Jewish
There's
cemetery.
only one?
Yeah, only one, Children of Israel, 1893.
It looks as if it's broken up into many.
No, it's one cemetery, but there's different sections.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but
There's
it's
technically
one.
three properties on Middle Road. If you look it up on the, like on the Haverhill website for the assessor's office, so there are like three different, like one's a 12-acre plot, one's 5, but they're all attached.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
Why did you say they had to leave the Pale?
To stay alive. It basically is the answer, to stay alive.
What was the question?
I mean, my grandfather was terrified that he would be snatched to join and be cannon fodder in the Tsar's army, and which was a sure death. Ah, Hillary.
Hi, the Yankee owners moved north. This was after the strike, you were saying. They thought they could have.
Right, like Exeter or Nashua or Manchester.
So they sold it, or they gave it to, so.
No, they
And
didn't.
there were Jewish owners of the home?
What happened was they abandoned the factories, they took their machinery and left. And so, since the new owners could lease the machinery and get started, they just really figured it out as they went.
So there were many Jewish people who became owners.
Correct.
Many, many people don't realize that the Jewish population contributed heavily to the Revolutionary War. My father's ancestors bought Haverhill from the Indians in 1642. Silver Hill was our farm, and I haven't been able to verify this yet, but I'm still trying to. In our family history, it talks about the Silvers coming from Denmark. And in the Haverhill records, which I haven't been able to substantiate because Howard Curtis told me about it, but now he's dead, it said that there were strange chantings and lights in the Silver House on Friday night. I believe they were Jewish, but I don't know anybody who knows, and I would love to know more. Because they've been here forever. And I'm very proud of my father's heritage, and my grandmother didn't know she was koshering chicken, putting salt in it, because she didn't have any Jewish friends. She didn't know. But I think that it was tradition that was passed down.
And a lot of the converso, that story rings true in the Southwest United States and New Mexico and so forth. You find stories like that. So again, when you spoke earlier, I don't know.
Well, the
I
first
would say
the
right
first
over.
Jewish community on the East Coast moved up from Recife, Brazil in the 1600s to New York. You know, some of those people kept migrating. They moved out of New York and kept looking for opportunities north.
What
So-
I'm told is that many of these Jewish people were escaping Inquisition, however and wherever they came from. And many of them intermarried with the lost ancestors, some of whom were mine. And I'm very proud of that side. But I can't substantiate it because it doesn't go back and it's not
It's not
recorded.
documented.
It's not documented officially. My family brought a Gutenberg Bible with them when they came in 1631, Winthrop's fleet. And one of my stupid cousins sold it at a yard sale. She was in North Carolina. Daniel Silver, who was from Haverhill, was 17 years old, from Silver Hill, my ancestor. He fought at the battle
Wow.
of Bunker Hill. And the family, according to our Bible, prayed on their knees all day long, facing south. They could smell the acrid smoke, they could see it, they could hear the cannons. They had no idea if they'd come home, and they all came home safely.
Excuse
So
me.
I want to know more.
Excuse me.
So I appreciate this tremendously.
Yeah, as I had started before, just send an email to Special Collections and ask them for help. Are there any other questions? Because we've already run past 8 o'clock.
I want to thank